Something just occurred to me when Don was talking earlier. Last year, I preached twice at Simpsonville Christian Church. And the first time was in September, I believe, and the second time was on Veterans Day of last year. And I preached on the passage from Mark that talks about the widow and giving her last 2 coins to the temple treasury. And I talked a little bit about a friend of mine who is a veteran of the war in Iraq. His name is J.B. And as Don was talking, I was just thinking about J.B. And I haven't seen him in years. And I pray that he's doing well. And he was a guy that, when I knew him, was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and having a very difficult time just to function in society, going into a Walmart or going to anywhere where there was crowds and noise and things like that. And I had no experience with folks who bear that particular wound, but after having that experience, I have another deeper appreciation for those who have answered the call to serve this country. So I greatly appreciate JB and the veterans in this room and those who have answered that particular call. So thank you. Thank you. Today we're talking about a ritual, a celebration that is celebrated as a perpetual ordinance throughout the generations. And it just occurred to me that I don't even have to give an introductory sentence to what I'm about to say. I can just say, turkey, mashed potatoes, green beans, sweet potato casserole with that layer of gooey melted marshmallows on top. In that plate of the red jelly stuff that's cut into slices that we pass, they tell me it's cranberry sauce, but you'd have to ask someone else because I have this rule against eating anything that still bears resemblance to the can that it came out of. Thanksgiving has become one of my favorite holidays. For obvious reasons, I love to eat. You know, when I was a little kid, Halloween was my favorite for obvious reasons, and Christmas because of the presents and all of that. But as I've grown older, I've come to appreciate the traditions of Thanksgiving more and more and more. And I know that this year, after I stuffed myself well past the point that I should stop. And even though I made the promise to myself last year that I wasn't going to do it again, I promise I'm not going to do it again. I know I'm going to do it again. And then I will be presented with my dilemma, which comes in the form of a table of pies. And then I have to find a way to get the room to stuff 1 or 3 slices of pie down in there before I stumble over to the couch and sort of waver in that half-consciousness as I watch some football team score touchdown after touchdown after touchdown against the Detroit Lions. I don't know if there's any Lions fans. Sorry. The Cowboys I meant to say the Cowboys. But, I don't necessarily know if the reason that we began celebrating Thanksgiving translates through the generations. I mean, when I was in elementary school, they said Thanksgiving was instituted in 1621 after the first successful harvest of the Pilgrims in the New World with the assistance of the Native Americans, and they sat down and they had this feast. And when I was in elementary school, we would all sit down with these construction paper black funny hats and the feathers. Do they still do that in elementary schools? Yeah, we don't do it in our living rooms though. I don't know what happens there. But that's okay, because the things that I love about Thanksgiving go beyond the food. It goes beyond the historical background. It has a lot to do with the family. You know, I just love being around all of that family. When I was growing up, we have a big family. Both of my parents have lots of siblings, which means I have lots of aunts and uncles and tons of cousins. And I'm one of the oldest of all the cousins, which means that I was one of the first to graduate from the kid table to the adult table. Y'all have a kid table at your Thanksgiving? Yeah, the little card table with 6 chairs all gathered around it. Well, I got to graduate to the adult table pretty early on to make room for the other cousins coming up. And that's where the action is. I mean, that's where all the really good, juicy stories are, is at the adult table. And I remember sitting there listening with wide eyes of Aunt and Uncle so-and-so that live across the country, that only come home over the Thanksgiving holidays and hear about all the things that had happened in the previous year. And then I get to hear the stories that I've heard over and over and over and over again, told just one more time. And I know where all the dramatic pauses are, and I know where the punchlines are. But I tell you, when you're sitting there in that context of Thanksgiving, and you're hearing that story for the 10th, 12th time, it still doesn't fail to bring that same sense of joy and laughter and all of that as though you're hearing it for the first time. I love Thanksgiving because of all of the joy and the happiness that it brings to spend time with the people that I love, my family. And that's appropriate, of course, for this month. In November, I'm not doing a sermon series per se, but there is a theme of the month. And the theme is happiness. Now, last week we talked a little bit about happiness, what it is, how to get us some of that, and what deep abiding happiness should be and how come it's so fleeting. And we heard Paul's definition of happiness as the peace of God which surpasses all understanding. And we talked about that peace as being like a life-giving river that flows deep, deep down beneath the surface of our life, where all kinds of circumstances can create heartache and suffering and pain and so forth. But if we can listen to the Scriptures and dig our spiritual wells, we can access that water that will provide us with the peace and also give us an opportunity to be useful, to be a channel of that peace for other people, which is what we're called to do. Also, last week I talked a little bit about some of the research that I had studied that has been done on happiness. And there is a lot of it. There's an entire branch of psychology called positive psychology. And I got to watch this documentary and all these various stories of people who were dealing with the issue of happiness and resiliency and adaptation. And one of them was a Navy, I think he was a Navy pilot, named Bob Shoemaker, who was shot down over North Korea. And he spent 8 years in a POW camp. And it was very, very difficult. He told this harrowing story of the abuse that he endured, but he did survive it, and he was able to come home and enjoy a very happy, rewarding, fulfilling life. And one of the researchers that studies POWs who was on this documentary said that he had asked Bob and other POWs this question: if you had the power to eliminate that experience from your life, if you could erase it as though it never happened, would you? And he said an interesting thing happened. Bob, like most of the POWs, said no, that they wouldn't. That there were certain lessons that they had learned, certain truths that they had uncovered, certain things about themselves that they had learned that only that experience could have brought them. So no, they wouldn't erase it even if they could. And that points to one of these paradoxes about happiness. You know, the brain is an amazing adaptive machine. But the nervous system is a machine of differentials, meaning that it measures and it integrates differences between two states, and that's how it understands where we're at. So quite literally, there is no happiness without unhappiness. There is no pleasure without pain, because the brain understands what happiness is in contrast to its polar opposite. I thought that was very interesting. Bob said that he appreciated freedom more than most people because he had lived for so long without freedom. Now, I think that's interesting when we look at the scripture passage that we heard this morning from Exodus. This is one of my favorite pieces of scripture out of the whole Bible, and I don't know why, but it always has this very vivid scene in my mind. I can picture exactly what's going on in this particular scene. And if you're not familiar with the entire Exodus narrative, I'll tell you just briefly. The people of Israel, these are the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Israelites have been held in slavery in Egypt for 430 years. And their God, Yahweh, has heard the cries of the people and has decided to come in and to set His people free. And so he goes to Moses and he says, Moses, this is what I want you to do. I want you to go to Pharaoh and I want you to demand to set my people free so they can go into the wilderness and worship me. And after a lot of struggling and resistance and reluctance, Moses finally says yes. And he goes before Pharaoh again and again and again. He goes 9 times and says, let my people free. And Pharaoh says no, and so God brings 9 plagues. And then this last time Moses goes before Pharaoh, and he says, because you have not let God's people go, after midnight tonight, God will pass through the land, and he will strike down all of the firstborn, from the firstborn of the livestock to the firstborn of the king of Egypt. And then he storms out of the room. And then they have this scene where Moses is given instructions about how to observe the Passover. And he says that you will gather animals a certain way, and you will take the lamb, and you will slaughter the lamb a certain way, and you will cook it a certain way, and you will eat it a certain way. You will eat it in haste. You will eat it with your sandals on your feet, and your loins girded, and your staff in your hand, ready to go at any moment, because this is the night that I will pass through the land of Egypt. But you will take the blood of the lamb, and you'll put it on your doorposts. And as I pass through the land, I will see the mark of the blood on the doorpost, and I will know to pass over, and you all will be saved. And so that's precisely what happens. And then there's a great wailing that arises from the land of Egypt, and Pharaoh finally says, yes, you all can go. And so they plunder the Egyptians and they leave Egypt. And it isn't long until Pharaoh changes his mind and sends his armies after them. And as they approach the Red Sea, we have this dramatic moment where where Moses lifts his arms, and the Red Sea parts, and they pass through, and they get to the other side, and then the armies of Pharaoh come down, and God closes the waters on top of them, and they all drown. And finally, in that moment, after 430 years of slavery, 430 years of suffering, they finally, in that moment, have that freedom that has been promised to them. But what's interesting is God doesn't tell them to celebrate that moment. God says the moment that you will celebrate was that night before the Passover. That night that I passed through the land and struck down all the firstborn. And the reason I think is similar to this truth that we know about happiness, that we cannot experience happiness without unhappiness, we cannot experience pleasure without pain, we cannot experience the joy of freedom without the experience of oppression. And what happens in that moment before they are set free, they have one foot in slavery and they have one foot in freedom. There is that tension that they have. And I think that's important, because if they were supposed to celebrate the moment after the victory, it probably wouldn't be too many generations before the people of Israel started to revise history and think to themselves, I think it was us that defeated the Egyptians, and I think it was us that set ourselves free. I think that we're the ones that brought us here to the Promised Land. But because they're called to remember that moment with one foot in slavery and one foot in freedom, they know that it was the power of God that had set them free. And that power of God is so important to the identity of the Hebrew people. Now, what I wonder is, that night when they were all waiting for the Passover of the Lord, I'm sure it was a very tense night. The scene that I have in my head is not anything like Thanksgiving. There's no stories, there's no laughter, there's no football team on the television set. It's a very tense night. And I have to put myself in that situation. I'm wondering if they're all sitting around silent, listening for the movement of Yahweh in the land of Egypt. I wonder if they're listening to see if they can hear the moment that Yahweh moves through the land to execute judgment on their oppressors. You know, rituals, and what we have here, the Passover is a ritual. Church worship services are also a ritual. Holidays that we celebrate, including Thanksgiving, is a ritual, even though we don't like the word ritual, we might just call it a tradition or something like that. These rituals are very important to us. They help us to step out of the busyness of our day-to-day lives. And I know that no matter what's going on in my life and how busy I am with any particular thing, or how much money I have or I don't have, I know on Thanksgiving I'm expected to be somewhere. And so I always find a way to get there to Thanksgiving. And when I do get there to Thanksgiving, I experience that comfort and that peace and that stability that the tradition of Thanksgiving has provided us in our family. And I think that the rituals that we celebrate in the church and through our faith also provide that same comfort, that same peace. Now, with that in mind, I want to offer another definition of the word happiness. Another way to describe happiness, I believe, would be to say that we are in the presence of God. To be in the presence of God is to be happy in a very, very deep way. Now, some people would say, so I guess the point is that we need to find out where God is. And others might say, well, isn't God everywhere? Well, I believe that God is everywhere. And I believe that to be in the presence of God provides happiness. But of course, we're not always happy all the time. Now, the reason that I think that we're not happy all the time is because God is everywhere, but God is only in reality, right? God is only in reality. God cannot exist in fantasy land. And our problem is that we spend a tremendous amount of time in fantasy land. There's two particular neighborhoods I know that you all are very familiar with. One of them is called the past. We go into our minds and we spend a long time, days, sometimes weeks, even months or years in the past, replaying these events that have gone again and again and again, over and over in our minds, and we feel the resentments, we feel these desires that things should have turned out the other way. And we spend so much time locked into the resentments of the past that we don't spend any time in the present. And God is not in that imaginary neighborhood. And if we're not in the past, then we're in that other neighborhood, which is the future, where we've imagined all of these things that are going to happen. We're just sure that they're going to happen because we just know that that's the way it's going to be. And so we spend all of our time worrying about the future and being afraid of what we're sure is going to happen. And so we spend this time in fantasy land of the future and not any time in reality. And so God is not there either. But if you want to experience this peace that surpasses all understanding, this deep sense of joy and happiness, we need to get to where God is. And God is only in the here and now. God is only in the present moment. Now, what does this have to do with the rituals? Well, the rituals that we practice, the Passover tradition that was carried forward year after year, generation after generation, these are ways that we can step back into reality. It might look from the outside that we're leaving reality and going into these old rituals, but actually the opposite could not be more true. We are stepping out of the illusions of that world outside of these walls, and we are stepping into the real reality where God is. This place where we can't get our mind around necessarily what is happening. This place where we encounter the mystery in the presence of God. And when that happens, when we come into the presence of God, it has this capacity to change who we are. It has this capacity for time to slip away. And suddenly these things that happened thousands of years ago, that moment in which God set the people of Israel free, did not only happen thousands of years ago, but it also has the ability to happen right here, right now. And that's very important because when we step into the mystery of God, when we come into the presence of God, we're liable to have our lives turned upside down. We're liable to have our value system turned upside down. And what happens oftentimes is our eyes will open to see things that we did not see before. When we encounter God, and I'm talking about the powerful God, Yahweh, who came through the land and set the people of Israel free, when we encounter that God, it's liable to turn everything on its head. And our eyes will open and we will see people in the world who were not enslaved thousands of years ago, but who are in slavery today. Did you know there are 28 million human slaves in the world today in 2013. We don't see it when we go about our day-to-day lives, but when we encounter God, our eyes will open and we see things like that. This weekend, I was watching this thing on my iPad. I don't have television, but I do have access to things that I want to watch, and I was watching this documentary, and they were talking about children in Haiti who still, years and years and years after that earthquake, still don't have enough food to eat. They don't have the ability to buy rice, and so what they do is they make cookies out of dirt and water. and sell them for 5 cents, and this is what children eat. And it's only because I've encountered the presence of that powerful God that I'm able to look at that kind of thing and not turn away in horror and disgust. It's the only way that I can look at the realities of people who suffer in the world, and I can say that this powerful God that has come into the world and has set His people free once, will do it again. The power of God will come into the world, and if I am so moved to compassion to feel what it is that they are feeling, to feel about these people the way that God feels, then I know that my job is to relent to that power and let the power of God use me to come into the world to do it again. I'll tell you one of the reasons that I'm a Christian. I have a lot of these stories. Why am I a Christian? One of the reasons that I'm a Christian, I just remembered again when I was talking to a friend of mine last week. And we were both talking about our journeys of faith. And I said, you know, Christianity, like any great philosophy, has a lot of wonderful arguments. It has a lot of beautiful things about it. It has this remarkable culture that surrounds it. But there's something else about the gospel. You see, in the history of this country, we have this dark mark on our history called slavery. And there was a period of time in which the religious people in this country were struggling with that. And people, by all accounts of the conventions of the time, who considered themselves to be good Christians, used Christianity to indoctrinate their own slaves and to teach them Christianity and Christian faith, to impose upon them this foreign religion and this foreign culture. And they used this system of religion as a way to indoctrinate, as a way to control, in a way to pacify their slaves, to teach them that God wanted them to be slaves. And I said, the reason that I'm a Christian is because the gospel is so powerful. The gospel is so resistant to be used as a weapon by human beings. The gospel is so subversive, and even when it was given to a group of people with all those sinister reasons, the power of gospel was enough to give those people who were being oppressed hope. And it was able to give them access to a power greater than themselves that eventually was able to overcome that institution called slavery in this country. It was so powerful, it was enough to lead a nation in nonviolent resistance to earn its civil rights. And it was so powerful that it's still working today. And when I look around the world and I see that church is doing it wrong, that church is doing it wrong, that church is doing it wrong, I don't need to worry, because the gospel is so powerful, it will work in the world to do what it has always done, despite all of our efforts to do otherwise with it. That is how powerful the gospel is, and that is why I am a Christian. Now, this wonderful ritual that we have presented today here in the Passover is something that all good observant Jews have done throughout history, including Jesus and His disciples. In fact, this table right here and the Lord's Supper was literally a Passover meal. And I wonder if when the disciples gathered around that table, if just like the people who gathered around the first table, if they could feel the presence of God move through the land. I wonder if those disciples, when they gathered around this table for the first time, could feel the presence of God right in front of them. And I wonder if as they gathered around that table and they celebrated in the reenactment of this ritual what God had done once in the history of their people, I wonder if they realized that God was doing it again right now. And that God was acting in that moment to set us free once again, this time of sin and oppression and of death. And if this final movement was going to be once and for all to show the people that God's love wins out in the end. I wonder if we know that when we come to the table. If we do, if when you come to this table to walk in that ancient ritual, to walk in that ancient mystery, to feel the presence of God, to feel the power of God move through us all, I wonder if you will respond the only way that we should respond, which is to celebrate.